of contemplation together. And before I'll guide you through it, I'll explain something about it, which might make it easier to see what this contemplation really wants to do, or what we are aiming for. I've already mentioned several times that there are two levels of reality. One is the relative reality in which we live, and one is an absolute reality which looks different from the one that we live in. Now, the one we live in is guided mostly by our optics. What we see, we believe. We still interpret differently, each one in their own way, but when we see it, we believe it. When we hear it, we might. But we hear very differently from each other. Even when you hear the same thing, it comes out different in everyone's mind. And the other senses, particularly the thinking, is the one we believe most. Now, I think it goes without saying that that kind of worldview must be extremely limited. We can't see beyond the horizon with our optics. We can't look around a corner, and we cannot see ultraviolet light, which bees can see. So our optical capacities are extremely limited. Now, the other thing that we really believe in is our thinking capacity. And of course, there we have a very strong opinion about our own ability. Some people's opinion about their own ability to think is so strong that they cannot bear to be told that they're making a mistake. And if they're told that they have made a mistake, the person who's telling them might be their enemy forever, and considered to be rather stupid on top of it. Now, we've all encountered that. We might even have done it ourselves. Who knows? And where do we get all this stuff from that we're thinking? Well, mostly we're getting it out of books. And some of it out of fantasy, what we'd like to have happen, or how we would like to see the world. But most of it is out of books. Why do we believe books so much? Just because it's printed? It's always been like that, just because it's printed. It's somebody else's worldview that's being printed there. And that person might have made a study of a certain subject and give all sorts of details on that subject, which makes it sound really professional. And then we're even more apt to believe it. To believe books, as long as we're learning a profession, is fine. And that's where it stops. All of these things that mainly the optical and the thinking, those two are the strongest, are fine for everyday living. They're all right for survival. They're great for a profession, a job, whatever it is, how we make our money to survive. but they certainly do not have the capacity to widen our view, to give us an extra insight, to have a consciousness which goes beyond this everyday and so common marketplace mentality. None of that can do it. If we can't see it, it's not there. If we can't think it, we don't believe it. Certainly, that limit puts such a limit to our capacity which a human being has, that one should really have a second thoughts whether that could ever be sufficient. Yet it is the relative reality in which we live. In this relative reality, each person sits there by him or herself on their own chair or cushion and has his or her difficulties to meditate, is bounded by the extension of their body and certainly bounded by the extension of their mind. Some can do loving kindness better, some can do it worse, whatever it is. Some can concentrate better, some can not concentrate. This is all a relative reality where each person is separate. In this separation, we feel threatened. There's fear. It can't be any other way, even though we may not be aware of it. Most people do become aware of it here and then, now and then. And as they do, they think that there's a special cause for that fear. A nasty person, or a nasty situation, or sickness, or whatever happened, that's the cause for that fear. But that's not so. The fear is within, and it is the fear which we can call existential anxiety. It's a good name for it because it answers practically the whole gamut of fears. And this existential anxiety arises out of the fact that we think we are separate. We are one, alone. And nobody escapes the notion that this universe is rather large, even though we might never think of it. It is embedded in our consciousness. We do know that this universe is fairly large. And we do know that there are innumerable galaxies. And we also do know that this Earth is only a tiny speck in one of the galaxies. And we also know that this Earth is inhabited by billions of people, and that we ourselves are not even the size of a pinhead compared to the size of everything else. We don't like to give it much thought, but we all know it. In fact, we can see it. It can be depicted. We've heard it. But we haven't possibly taken note of the fact that we feel that threatening, that we feel insecure because of the minuteness of this personal being and the vastness of everything around us. We haven't taken real note of the fact that this encourages and incurs fear in us. It's a fear of being totally separated and incapable of standing up to all that which surrounds us. Now, our usual remedy for that is to make ourselves a little more important. If we are a little more important, maybe nothing will happen. And we usually have some ways and means of doing that, even if we can just become more important than the person we live with. That's also a very common way of doing things. Of course, it doesn't work too well, but it's a very common way of doing things. At least there's some importance. And that's supposed to avert the threat that we see all around us, because we know very well that there's nothing to be secure in. We know it even consciously. Subconsciously, everybody knows it, but even consciously we know. Where is security? It's quite clear that this separation makes us feel isolated. And that's why we are looking for someone to appreciate us. And if we can't find that someone, we feel really bereft. If we have that someone, and then that someone stops appreciating us, which is only too common, then we're feeling even more bereft. It's all a sort of way of looking at things which can never really work out and is so limited that the limitations in themselves already promise disaster. Whatever is that limited will never work. So the relative reality in which we live is not sufficient, and yet most people in this world try to make do with it, believing what they see and believing what they think. And on top of that, believing that they think better. That's another way of trying to avert the threat of annihilation. Now, if we take another look at the size of each person within this universe, we know for a fact that it's so minute, it can't even be expressed. If we look at that and really take a good look and embed that in our consciousness, we may feel quite upset by that. We're so unimportant. Everything that we do is so unimportant. The person I am is so tiny, and we might feel really a sense of tragedy, thinking of all the things we're trying, and yet there's such a smallness to us. That too is relative reality. That's the relative or the other side of the coin. On one side, it's me, and I'll be a little more important and nothing will happen to me. And on the other side, it's I'm so tiny. I have nothing to back me up. Everything is going to be against me. It's really dangerous. So both sides are relative, and both are extremes, and both are thought processes. One makes a person depressed and give an underlying mood of disgust or rejection, and the other side gives a person an inflated sense of ego. Both are difficult to live with for the person who has them, for their surroundings also, of course, but they can possibly just pretend it isn't happening, which one can do. But for the person who has either one of those, it's very difficult. And most people actually use both, go from one extreme to the other. useless, of course. And yet, we need to have a totally different view and a totally different entry into, let's say, the universe in order to change that. That we aren't specifically important and somebody special, that's one thing. Being so tiny and totally lost in the whole of it is another thing. The reality of it is that we're connected. And that has to be experienced. And that's why we're using the methods that the Buddha has given us, the methods of meditation and contemplation, so that we can actually experience this connectedness. The connectedness is absolute reality. There are no boundaries. We've made them ourselves. There are no separations. We've made them ourselves. The togetherness is a fact, but not just because we're in the same room, or because we happen to have the same idea, or because we happen to go to the same school or the same party. Nothing like that. The togetherness is much more profound than that. It's the scientific fact of having nothing but particles in the whole universe that are constantly interacting. We've probably all read about that or heard about it. That aeroplane was just interacting with us. Everything is constantly interacting. We just have to put our attention on it. We've probably heard and read, or either one, about the understanding that physics has of the universe. But what's lacking, not only for us, but for the physicists themselves, is to recognize the fact that we are part and parcel of all that. We belong right with it. We are a natural phenomena. That's all we are. And this natural phenomena is not unimportant, but it doesn't stand alone. And when we realize that, we can eventually feel embedded in the whole of creation, which we should feel embedded in it. We can eventually feel that there is no other. There's not somebody out there and I'm in here. We're all in it together. And as we feel that, loving kindness and compassion are the natural outcomes of that. The natural outcome, then, of loving kindness and compassion is also the lack of fear and self-supporting egocentricity. There is nobody that's apart from another, which also totally removes the idea of tolerance. You don't have to tolerate anyone or anything. It's all me anyway. Tolerance, for instance, for other religions. It's a very nice step on the way and very important but it certainly isn't absolute truth. It's still relative. I am tolerating you, but that's not the real truth. The real truth is that I and you are the same. And then there's nothing to tolerate. Things just are the way they are. That's then one step further. Now, to go that step further through contemplation, which we will do together, and maybe get an inkling of it. It may not be totally clear right away. There's no need for that. These are all steps on the way. But to do this through contemplation will give a very distinct outline and an indication of what it really means to have this human body and also to have the human mind, because it can do, the mind can do far more than what we usually do with it. We are limiting ourselves immensely, and within those limits we've got problems with a capital P. And those problems with a capital P are then our world. Doesn't make sense, does it? This world is not problems. This world is a school for grown-ups. And all we need to do is watch the signs and listen with our heart to what is really going on, and we'll know. The personal problems that people encounter are all based on those two extremes. The fear that one is small and can't stand up to whatever is happening, or that one is larger, bigger than what one really is, and therefore has difficulties with the next person that also wants to be bigger. This problematical way of looking at life is essentially totally useless. Problems, once solved, bring a new one. They don't disappear. But what can disappear is our wrong world view and our wrong self-view. There are people who are professional worriers. You ask them what they're worrying about and they have to think a moment. And then they come up with things, of course. They worry about becoming sick, getting old, dying, not having enough money, children not making good, all that sort of thing. My children and your children are exactly the same. They're just somebody's children. That whole idea of separation between people and nature around us, and between nature and the universe, that's all mind-made stuff. Has no reality. Physics know that, have long written about it, have made even tests. In America they made tests in what's called a bubble chamber, and they found out that the whole thing interacts all the time. Everything is in constant movement. Nothing is separate from the next thing. And yet, we believe our eyes. Optical illusion. Once we get past that optical illusion, we're bound to think it's funny. How could we have been so blind? And yet, every time we look, everybody looks separate. So anything that we really understand from inside out, we need to resurrect in the mind over and over again until we can never make that same mistake again of thinking that I am separate from the rest of the world, that I am separate from the you, and that the you is other than the I, and that the they is totally different from the we. These are conventional ways of speaking. Buddha used them too, because we have to use the conventions, otherwise we don't make ourselves understood very well. It's hard enough to understand another person anyway. Usually one can only understand the other person if one's had the same experience. And that's why the Buddha advised to do it, to have the method, to practice it, so that there will be some people who can understand it from their own experience. We have a very difficult time understanding things just by being told. It's natural, because our thinking capacity is very limited. May we ever be so clever? It's still limited. It's limited to what we can dream up in the mind. Nothing else can be thought about. But when we experience something new, then there is that ability to recognize it for what it is, the truth, and as we recognize it for the truth and resurrect that truth within us over and over again, then it becomes part of our world and self-view. When the world and the self-view have changed from the limited, from the personal, to the universal, unlimited, fears are greatly reduced. They only arise again when we go back into the personal and limited. When we let that go, the personal and limited, and feel ourselves part of everything, fear cannot arise. What are we fearing for? That they're going to throw us out of the club or what? We're in it. We're in it. We can't help it. Nobody can help it. We're there. So nobody can throw us out. So there's nothing to fear. One of the 5 hand mudras that we have very often with Buddha's statues is the hand, either right or left, held like this, which means no fear. Nothing to fear. Nothing there to fear. But we do need a different view. And that different view we can also recognize, and which is important, that relative reality has its place in the marketplace. There's no two ways about it. If you want to go and buy something in a shop, you've got to pay some money for it, even though we're all one and everything is the same. They're not going to take that as payment. So we have a relative reality in the marketplace, just has to be the one that rules it. But as it rules that, we can recognize almost immediately when it's pointed out that that can't be all there is. Relative reality happens, of course, as we make a living anywhere, at any time. But if we don't get at least an inkling that there's something else, we'll never be satisfied, we'll never be fulfilled. And there's another thing that we need to know, and it's a constant bother. We can't bring the two together. This is one of the difficulties with Zen koans. People try to solve Zen koans on the level of relative reality. They make no sense whatsoever. In fact, they sound stupid. The sound of one hand clapping, I mean, it's useless on a relative reality level. Or what was my face before I was born? It doesn't make sense. That's only in relative reality. In absolute reality, it's obvious. There's no question about it. So, it's all happening all the time, everywhere. No separation. What's the difference whether one hand's clapping or two? It's all one. So this is something that we have to remember also when we question or try to understand some of the Buddha's teaching. On relative reality, we have the level of purification. We have to purify heart and mind, the one that we live with, that heart, that mind, not the next one's heart and mind. Mine. That's relative reality. And the Buddha gave any number of methods and ways of doing that. Then we come to meditation. On relative reality, I am meditating. And I ought to be. What else should I be doing in a meditation course anyway? But meditation is for the one who's doing it. That hasn't gone beyond the relative reality of me sitting there doing it. But having then been able to concentrate and let go of the mundane, worldly thinking, then it's possible to enter into states of consciousness which are so vast and are quite beyond relative reality, so that they give us an inkling what absolute reality can be like. This meditation is the bridge between the relative reality of me purifying myself, me concentrating, me practicing, to the insight into the whole of it. The insight into this vast conglomeration of existence, this vast conglomeration of creation. So then, having done those things on that level, they cannot be questioned on the absolute level because they don't belong there. These two levels are apart from each other, and each one has, of course, its own justification. Sometimes people who hear or even experience a little bit of absolute level of reality then think, and this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, that that's the way they have to live, and the rest of the things that are to be done in the world are of no concern whatsoever. Doesn't work. They're floating around in a no man's land, so to say, and can't really put their feet down. As long as we have a body, we also have the need for relative reality. But we must, can, always remember that that's only one part of the whole thing. And it is the part which is geared for survival. That's all. And that part is the one that creates fear if we don't know that there's something else. So when we question, for instance, nothingness, or when we question the fact that there's an illusion. Well, that's on the absolute level. But if it's me wanting to have the understanding of nothingness, I'm trying to put the two levels together. The relativity of me and the absoluteness of nothingness. And it doesn't work. They don't operate together. The relative reality is the one that keeps us alive, it's for survival. And the absolute reality is the one that gives us the insight into the universal and total and complete consciousness which pervades the universe. Well, on that level of a consciousness which pervades the universe, if I see then nothingness, I see something entirely different. So the warning is not to confuse the two levels, which happens constantly. It happens over and over again, because it sounds so intriguing to have something which is absolute and which really takes the burden off my own shoulders, because everybody is helping me to carry the burden. It's really very intriguing, but it doesn't relieve us of relative reality. That's got to be taken care of too. And the Buddha himself talked about I, me and mine in the conventional way of speaking when he was teaching people about the first two steps, purification in all its aspects and facets, and concentration, which brings the mind into the possibility of seeing something different. I went on so long about this confusion between relative and absolute because it's very widespread. It comes out in questions and difficulties over and over again. We have to realize that there's one thing I'm doing and there's another thing which I can become aware of. I think it's best to stand up and stretch our legs before we do the contemplation. This is called the contemplation on the four elements. And just to mention them ahead of time, the four elements are the constituents of all materiality. Everything that exists in a material way has those four elements in it. And these four elements are called earth, fire, water, and air or wind. That's their names. They also each have their own quality, and also they also have their own purpose and action. Now, earth has the quality of solidity. So one could call it solidity, but it's called earth element. And it has the purpose of being a foundation. Now, fire is temperature. It has the quality of temperature. It doesn't have to be hot. It's just temperature. And it has actually the ingredient of destruction. And water is liquidity, and it has the characteristic of binding. It means if you have flour and you put water in it, you get dough. It binds things together. And air or wind has the characteristic of movement. It's moving. When we move, when we make a movement with our bodies, the air which is there has been changed because the movement has changed it. So they all have their purpose and action, and they have their innate characteristic. And as we find them in ourselves through the contemplation, we might be able to connect to all that which is around us. In order to start, we'll put the attention on the breath for just a moment, just to become concentrated.